What is up, everybody? Welcome to Shoot the Gap, the IDP Fantasy Football podcast here at fantasyandframes.com. I'm your host, Jorge Edwards. I got Justin Taylor with me, aka JT. We're ready to talk some rookie defensive linemen today. Let's get to it. We spent a lot of time doing a lot of prep work earlier this year on Shoot the Gap, talking about recapping last year. We talked about free agency with Gary Davenport. We talked about, free agency landing spots. And it feels like we've been dancing around talking about the rookie incoming class. And so here we are, folks. Here's what you want to know heading into NFL draft season. We're talking over the next 3 weeks at defensive lineman, linebacker, and defensive back rookie prospects that we think can help you for fantasy football this coming year. Before I get into that, JT, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, man. I just updated my rookie IDP rankings so I'm pumped, ready for this episode. I think we got some good guys to talk about, and I like the idea we can talk about strategy a little bit here for IDP, but when it comes to D line, is sometimes that can kind of be depending on your format and what you do. Can definitely be different ways you want to look at it. So I'm excited to kind of talk about that.
Absolutely. And for those who are just tuning in now, remember this is Fantasy and Frames Wednesday. We had our Dynasty 365 show at 8. The guys over on Fourth and Frames conducted their third rookie mock draft. If you miss any of that, head over to our YouTube channel. You can watch both episodes there. Don't forget to like and subscribe as you're watching. They have all of their Twitter information on there. Give them a follow. They deserve it. They've been working their butts off this year, have been for the past couple years here at Fantasy and Frame. So really deserve their flowers. And of course, if it's late at night and you don't have time to watch something, these podcasts will be available tomorrow on Apple and Spotify. So look forward to that. I want to give a shout out again to Stacey Perez for organizing the Fantasy and Frames Women's Best Ball Challenge. The live drafts we've had, first of all, on Sunday night with Bob Harris. And then last night with Eric Balkman, just fantastic participation in the chats. Thank you very much for people who have been tuning in for those Best Ball live drafts. Tomorrow, we have one more to go where Stacey's going to have Keith Fleming on at 10 p.m. Eastern to conduct the very last of the Best Ball Challenge drafts. So shout out to Stacey Perez for organizing this here at Fantasy and Frames, because we do care and we do want to show our support for all the women out there in the fantasy football landscape and to celebrate Women's History Month. And with that, let's get into what we're here to talk about today. We're talking about defensive linemen for IDP purposes. So JT, when we're talking about, defensive linemen, I like to think about edge rushers, but there is some, room to talk as far as defensive tackles, depending on the format you're playing for IDP, which site you're playing IDP on. So we're going to cover both. We're going to cover the edge rushers and the defensive ends or outside linebackers, as well as some of the defensive tackle spots. So we're covering all the different places you can be playing IDP fantasy football, as well as some gems here you should be paying attention to. And let's get right to it. For me, I'm going to go through my top edge rushers here. So the first one off the board here, Laiatu Latu. Did I say that correctly? Yes.
I think you got it.
Yes. I'm always horrible at butchering names, so I'm really glad I got that right. 6'5", 265 out of the University of California, Los Angeles. Look, in 2021, he suffered a serious neck injury. There was talk that he may never even play football again. Really serious stuff there. Then he comes back the past 2 seasons and just has dominated. 2022, 12 sacks. 2023, 15 sacks. You go to his productivity last year at UCLA, he was the edge rusher 2 overall in the Power 5 conferences. In total pressures was 62. He was number 1 in sacks, number 3 in defensive stops, number 1 in pass rush win rate. You look at some of the player comps out there. The TJ Watt is a name that's been thrown around, and I hate it when they do player comps, because how do you really know until you get drafted to the team you're going to? But the fact that you have Lance Zierlein and Bucky Brooks, comping him to that. That's pretty elite company there, and those are definitely some talent evaluators that I obviously pay attention to. There's talk of him being a good fit for being an outside linebacker in a 3-4. So just his freak athleticism, his production, applying pressure and getting to the quarterback to make plays, whether it's for fantasy, your sacks, your quarterback hits, your tackles for a loss. And yeah, you really can't go wrong here. Anything I didn't cover? Anything you want to add to lay out to?
I couldn't have Latu. I currently have him as my edge 3, and I'll tell you why. I think he has the highest upside as far as if he stays healthy, he plays on the right team. I think he has the number one. He is the number one guy upside wise. So I like him. I'm a little nervous with the injury history. Um, Depending on what team he ends up on, might make a difference for me. Sometimes on these defensive guys, I think, most of the time you get them in a situation, as long as they're playing the 4-3 or 3-4 that they usually do, I think you're pretty good. He to me is, I don't I don't want to use the term boom or bust because I don't think he's going to bust at all, but I think he has the most boom potential. I think he's the guy that could end up being that guy you look back in this draft and are like, man, how did I miss on him? He's getting 16 sacks a season, 18 sacks, multiple years. So I definitely think he's the highest end guy right now for me. He's 3. Depending on where he ends up getting drafted, he could easily jump to number 1. Not even as an edge, as my overall IDP 1. Right now, he's my IDP 3 on the edge, IDP 4 overall. But that definitely is fluid situation right now, as these guys have pro days. Some of these guys didn't do some stuff at the combine. They're doing some more stuff at the pro days. They're showing you a little bit different. So, but I definitely think you having him number 1, I can't argue with that.
We have Dynasty Deviant in the chat. Chris Burns. I heard that Chris Burns would be a monster in this draft class. That's awesome. You know where you'd be a monster also? Right back in the saddle here on Shoot the Gap. He should be back, folks, in a few weeks. Rumor has it. So, Chris, looking forward to having you back here on Shoot the Gap to join JT and myself, and eventually Nate Markham to talk some IDP fantasy football. We miss you, bud. And then for Calvin here, we're talking IDP rookie prospects, defensive linemen. So if you're into IDP fantasy football, or you just want to learn a little bit more about the defensive side of the ball and how that impacts fantasy football overall, stay tuned. All right, let me go to my second guy here. Well, before I get to the second guy, you're absolutely right. The injury history is something that scares a lot of people away from just immediately planting their flag and saying DL1, right? Or edge rusher 1. But for me, I really believe that if there was any drop off in productivity the year afterwards, I'd be a little bit concerned. He'd be further down my list. But the fact that he just jumped back into elite production when he was supposed to be written off, that's where I get some of the confidence that he can play very well. But I totally understand your point of view there as well. For me, number 2 is Jared Verse, 6'4", 260 out of Florida State. Again, not somebody who, or I shouldn't say again, but just he's not somebody who's been blowing the doors off with elite sack production year after year after year. But what we have been seeing is an increasing trend in sack production in pressures. This past year, he was the edge rusher 6 in pass rush ridden weight, edge number 5 in total pressures, edge number 3 in quarterback hits. The sack production wasn't super elite, but he got you there, getting he was edge rusher 12 in sacks. What I like about him the most is the fact that he has displayed versatility in playing either at a 4-3 or a 3-4. So schematically, wherever he gets drafted, I don't think there's going to be much of a learning curve adjustment here. Versus Latu, when I just mentioned earlier, like they were saying he's better suited for a 3-4, but he's got better productivity. You know what I mean? So it's really a situation where these top 2 picks right here, where you have the talent, so to speak, versus landing spot. And I think Jared Verse for a landing spot, will have an easier time adjusting than I would say a Latu, who may have a harder time adjusting, depending if they don't run a 3-4 defense here. You have any thoughts on Jared Verse?
Yeah, Verse right now is number 2 on my list. Overall, as far as edge and overall IDP, he's got over 40 tackles and 9 sacks each of the last 2 years. So, it hasn't been like some out of this world 14, 15 sack production, but he's been in there 9 sacks, 2 straight years, over 40 tackles is what you want to see from a defensive end. You don't want those guys that only get sacks and get nothing else. So he is able to help you in other areas. I think he fits on almost any defense. I don't think he's a specific guy like you said. I think he could fit pretty much anywhere. That's why I've got him really high. He's one of those guys, like I said, Latu, depending on where he fits, certain defenses draft him. I could be losing my mind and taking him number 1 if I love the fit. I think Verse is going to fit pretty well anywhere, no matter what they run. So I like Verse. He's my number 2 edge right now in this draft, and my number 2 overall IDP as well.
Love it. Getting to number 3 overall, getting to Dallas Turner. And folks, whether I'm talking about Leatu Latu, whether I'm talking about Dallas Turner, whether I'm talking about Jared Verse, these are kind of interchangeable players that you'll see in most player rankings, whether it's for IDP or for NFL scouting. So I don't think you can go wrong in your rookie drafts picking either one of these guys if you have a top 3 pick, if you're emphasizing, I shouldn't say top 3 pick, but if you're emphasizing defensive end early in your league or defensive lineman early in your league for a rookie pick, I don't think you can go wrong with X3. But let me talk about Dallas Turner. This past year, edge number 6 in total pressures, again, 6 in run rate. Here's what I like about him the most. Okay, take away all the athletics, talents and metrics there. We're talking fantasy football, right? And what is the thing I like to talk about the most? For those who don't know, I'm about to tell you. Even though you have an edge rusher or defensive lineman who can apply pressure to the quarterback, can make those tackles for a loss, can get those quarterback hits, I like edge rushers who also possess a solid tackle floor. And when you look over the course of his career, he has been super consistent with having a great solo tackle to assisted tackle numbers. So why do I care about that for fantasy? Because solo tackle numbers generally for most fantasy point scoring carry more weight than assisted tackles. So you're getting somebody who's elite at applying pressure, who can get to the quarterback and make plays, and is a good tackler. For me, that bumps him up a bunch of spots there. Obviously, I have him at number 3, so I can't really say too much more than that. What about you? We talk about Dallas Turner. Another thing, he was playing against opposite Will Anderson last year. Will Anderson gets drafted, or 2 years ago, gets drafted by the Texans. And, it's one of those things where, we talked about it in the free agent show. Does adding a edge rusher to a defensive line that already has an elite edge rusher on the other side, does that mask what their overall talent really is? Because you're getting more one-on-one opportunities, or are you just basically lucky that you just got 2 great pass rushers that are landing on your team? And I think it's the latter, just because of that run rate in college, edge rusher number 6, like that's something that you can't beat. And so that's taken into account one-on-one matchups, and I don't know. I really like his productivity. And for me, again, going back to fantasy, it's the tackle numbers and the solo assists that really bump him up for me. What about your thoughts here?
Yeah, so for me right now, I got Dallas Turner as my overall number 1 IDP and my number 1 edge rusher. To me, what makes him stand out is he's 2 years younger than the 2 guys we just talked about. He's just 21. Other guys are 23. So I like the fact that he's young. I think he's got room to grow. I think he's maybe the most athletically gifted of this group. Now, the issue with that is he's the smallest guy in this group. Uh, so that's the question on him. Is he big enough to set the edge? Can he do that? Is a team going to ask him to do that? He's about 6'4", about 242, so smaller than the other 2 guys we talked about just a little bit. But I think he's got great get off, great explosion off the line. Like you said, he can run down players. He can make tackles. He can play sideline to sideline. He's not a guy that just gets upfield and the play's over for him. He can cut, get blocked, get back in the play and make a tackle, which is why I really like him. That's why I love his athletic ability. Excuse me. And that's why that's why he's number one on my list. He just I think he ends up going. It's gonna be, it's been all over the place where he goes. I think there's a good chance he goes top 10. And if he goes top 10, people are going to be all over him. If, say, someone like Atlanta or someone takes him at 8, I think you're going to see, some teams in the mix on him early in IDP. And it could easily be one of the top IDP guys off the board. I love the athletic ability. A little nervous about saying the edge, but I'm hoping there's a team that isn't like making him do that on a regular basis where they're just saying, hey, like, get it, set that edge, hold it. Like, no, let him use his athleticism, let him get to the quarterback, let him run down running backs. And he's one of those guys, we see a lot of teams have kind of done these down blocks or coming back with like motion tight ends and people blocking back on the DNs. He's a guy I think is going to be very difficult to do that against. If you're lining up and you're like, hey, we're just going to swing down, kick him out, that's where I think, he's not the biggest guy in the world, but he's so athletic. He's going to make those guys miss. He's going to make those very difficult blocks to make. I think he can get through guys and make those tackles. I'm leaning for him. I think outside, like I said, I think Latu has the highest boom. I think he's right there underneath him, and he's a little bit younger. That's why I like Turner just a little bit more, but I think those two guys as pure pass rushers are probably the best two in this class. Turner I like more because I feel like the rundown ability, the ability to make tackles as well as rush the passer. I think he's one of the better edges as far as a guy that IDP fantasy wise is going to give you not just sacks, not just pressures, but he is going to give you those tackles.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue to the next player on the list here, and coincidentally hits another Alabama edge rusher, and that's Chris Braswell. You hit it right on the head. It's the tackles, the tackle upside. He's a high volume tackler. He's not somebody who's giving you a solo assist of 14-6. Like this guy's in the 20s in solo tackles. He was number 3 in sacks for PFF with 13, number 10 in pass rush win rate. Here's the thing that really impresses me the most. Now, you look at those two stats, you look at the ability to apply pressure to the quarterback and get those sacks, and you might think, oh, is Dallas Turner now freeing up Chris Braswell? Well, he was the edge rusher 14 in defensive stops, and Dallas Turner is down the list when it comes to that. So that tells me he's great at playing against the run. He's a great efficient tackler. He can get you those tackles for a loss. He can get you those quarterback hits. He can get those pressures. He can get you those fantasy points is what it all comes down to, right? So that's, for me, the fact that he is being able to get those defensive stops and get that high volume tackle opportunity and production. That for me kind of quelled my concerns as far as whether or not he was a product of Dallas Turner on the other side versus being his own person. And again, for me, going for my top 4, it was between him and Chop Robinson out of Penn State. And one of the things people say about Chop Robinson, well, he doesn't have the long track record, and he doesn't have the sack production, but he has the win rate production to get past his blocker. It's just for whatever reason that didn't translate. But you hear a lot about his athletic profile and his natural abilities. For me, that makes him that's a little concerning, to be completely honest with you, just because I want to see how win rate applies to pressures, applies to sacks. Because again, going back thinking about fantasy points here. So I am impressed with Chop Robinson out of Penn State, but Braswell for me is the one who jumps ahead of him. Any thoughts there?
Yeah. So for me, I like Braswell too. I have him just behind Chop Robinson for me. So so we're really close on this list. I have Chop as 4. I have Braswell as 5. I like Braswell a lot. I think it says something that he stuck it out at Alabama when he was stuck behind some guys. and ended up, instead of transferring, be like, I got to get out there. He stuck it out. And when he got his chance to play, he played well. I really liked his production, what he brought. He had, what I think he said, 6 threes, about 250, 255, 13 sacks last year, outstanding. He also is a guy we talked a little bit about that can play that 3-4 outside linebacker / DN. I think he's guys athletic enough to cover in space. I think he could take a tight end one-on-one and cover him if he was asked to get in the zone, but I think he could man up on a tight end if he needs to. I think he has enough athletic ability to do that. So that's why I like him too. I think, Turner's getting a little more of the buzz, in this class, but I would not be too far down on Braswell. I think he is a really solid player. Like I said, right now for me, as far as edges, he's my 5, just behind Chop. And I mean, I think the issue with Chop is, we'll talk about him, I'm sure, in a second, but the athletic ability of him is just through the roof. I think gives him just a slight edge over Braswell. But Braswell, to me, feels like that guy that he's not going to be the star edge, but he's going to be on the opposite end of a star edge. And then he's going to be that guy that is really good that people kind of forget about sometimes. He almost feels like, to me, like he's going to end up, if he ends up in the right situation, could he be the Alex Highsmith to TJ Watt?
Ooh.
Could he be that guy on the second backside that gets you those pressures? Isn't maybe going to be your number 1 edge rusher, but he's a guy that's going to make plays. He's going to be in the mix maybe every game. He's not giving you high fantasy production, but he's going to give you some monster games here and there. If he gets in the right situation in a 3-4 on a team like a Pittsburgh or like the Ravens, if he ends up on a team with already a good defense that has some nice outside edge rushers, I really like his upside being, like you said, that second guy. He doesn't necessarily have to be the man to still give you nice fantasy production. And he feels like a guy that could be kind of a sleeper on a team that you look at him, you're like, man, that guy he shows up, he produces, he plays well, but he's maybe not the sexy name on a defense for a team. But I like Braswell a lot. Like I said, I've got him currently number 5 as my DN edge guys.
So he'd be your Jonathan Grenard to Will Anderson last year, or your Andrew Van Ginkel to Jalen Phillips last year. Would be the another
Yes.
pair of
That's
comps
how I
there.
kind of feel like. I feel like he's going to be that guy. Like, he's probably not going to ask to be the number 1 on a team, but I don't think that hurts him. I think that helps him, that he's going to, if he gets on the side of another guy that's a pretty good edge rusher, and that he can be that, because again, if that other guy's seeing some double teams, if he's getting chipped with a tight end or a running back, and then he's left on the other side to just play one-on-one, yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that.
All right. Before we transition into now the defensive tackle side here, let's.
Are you have your last guy? Are you
No,
on your number 5?
I went into him with Chop Robinson a little bit in terms of the win rate.
I was gonna say, I was
there.
like, don't skip your number 5.
No. So for me, it was Chop Robinson based off of the athletic profile and the ability to beat his blocker. It's just, for whatever reason, last year that did not translate into sack production, and of course his tackle numbers aren't elite there. So it's not like a situation where you have an elevated fantasy floor. You know what I mean? But when scouts are saying, okay, he doesn't have the big track record or the longest track record, but this guy is a freak athlete. And you combine that with the fact that he's very good at beating his blockers. I really think, for IDP purposes, this is a guy who's kind of sack or bust, which is why I have him at 5. At least that's my rationale and my thinking for fantasy. But if he can find himself in the right situation, again, paired off with a 1B, I see. I don't think he's a 1A. Going back to what you were talking about Braswell, I think he's more suited to be a 1B defensive lineman for fantasy purposes. So yeah, those are my top 5 right there. Leato Latu, Jared Verse, Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell, and rounding out with Chop Robinson. Okay. So
yeah, and we were right there together. I had Turner 1, I had Verse 2, Latu 3, I have Chop Robinson 4, and then I had Braswell 5. So we're pretty in line there as far as that's concerned. And like you said, the thing with Chop, and this scares us every year, is you love to see those guys when you're like you see them in the NFL Combine, you're like your just jaw drops. You're like, oh, how does someone that size do the things that he does athletically? And then you watch the tape and you're like, why does this guy have 0 stats?
Right.
And it's like we get one of those guys, at least one of those guys, sometimes multiple guys every year. And the big question is, can he transition that athletic ability to production in the NFL, even if he didn't have production in college? I think that's going to be the big question for Chop. I mean, he's got every trait you want. It's just like, is it going to end up being fantasy, especially fantasy wise? Is it going to be enough to get production? I mean, you go back and you look at the combine results, guys, 6'3, 255, 4'4", 40, 4'4", at 6'3", 255 is insane. A 1.54 10-yard split is, there was wide receivers running that. I mean, that's ridiculous. Vertical jump 34.5, 10.8 broad jump, and a 4.25 20-yard shuttle. I mean, if you can knock it out of the park on, testing alone, he's one of those guys. He's right up there. Height, weight requirement, all that stuff. I mean, he's through the roof. The issue is, you just like we just said, you hope that he can figure out, get coached up in the NFL, and figure out how to use that athletic ability to turn into production. Because athletic ability doesn't help you in fantasy if they're never getting home, if they're
Right.
never making the solo, if they're never getting the sack. It's like, oh, well, he got a decent amount of pressures, or decent amount of hits, but no sacks. He got, quite a few assisted tackles, but he never gets the tackle, the solo
Right.
tackle. So I think that's where I think I could see Chop getting slightly overdrafted in some leagues, because there are gonna be some people that see the athletic profile and be like, I gotta have him. He's gonna be the next stud end. And while he may well be, and he definitely could be, the bust potential of a guy that's all athletic ability and no finish is always there in the NFL.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. All right. Should we transition to defensive tackles here? And maybe we should just give a disclaimer here in terms of like it really, the players we're talking about tonight, they're really also platform dependent. Um, for apps like Sleeper, they combine defensive ends and defensive tackles into one category, defensive linemen. Um, I try my best to stay away from MFL as much as possible because I know they do things a lot differently over there. And maybe JT, you can speak to that in terms of like, what MFL brings to the table for IDP.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm in quite a few MFL IDP leagues. My main home league, my 217 Dynasty League, is IDP, full IDP, and it is on MFL. So the big difference on MFL for people, if you're playing on different formats, because it is a little bit different than Sleeper. You can do defensive tackle and cornerback. You can break those guys out. So Sleeper does everyone on the D line is a D lineman. Everyone's a linebacker is a linebacker. Everyone that's in the secondary is a DB. And then they just added this last year to Sleeper. If you're an edge rusher, if say you're a 3-4 outside linebacker like a TJ Watt, they'll make you a D line / linebacker where you can actually slot those guys into a linebacker slot or a D line slot for your starting slot. Now, on my fantasy league side, and Gary Davenport will tell you this because he was one of the big proponents for MFL making this change, and I salute him because it was a change that I wanted to see made forever. I tried to individually do it in a league, and it became a nightmare scenario. So I quickly said, "Never mind, I'll just go with the standard of MFL." But a couple years ago, he was finally able to get them to standardize defensive end as outside rushers. So if you're a 3-4 outside linebacker, I use the Steelers a lot because I'm a Steelers fan, and they one of the teams that always stay in the 3-4, so that's why they're an easy example. So if you have a Alex Highsmith or a TJ Watt, they're considered outside linebackers as far as the NFL depth chart is concerned. Well, MFL, because those guys are rushing the passer most of the time, that's a majority of what they do. Not that they don't drop into cover, but the majority of what they do is rush the passer. Those are now considered D ends. So they that D end position on my fantasy league is kind of, you can almost call it the edge position. It's really edge now. So if you're an outside linebacker, or if you're in a 4-3 defensive front, and your defensive ends are your main rushers, those guys are then the D ends. Those are the edges. So what they've done is they made that adjustment so those guys are kind of one player. They're an edge rusher that now is considered D end. Now anyone who plays inside the tackles, so you line up, you have your zero tech right over the center if you're a nose tackle, and then you have your guys that kind of play either the 2, 3, or 4 tech, which just means you're going to be on the outside edge of the guard, inside eye of the tackle, or kind of head up the tackle. Anybody outside of that, is a 5, 6, 7 tech. 7 techs when those guys get real wide outside. So anybody that plays like head up or inside the tackle on a normal basis, they're considered now D tackle in MFL. So the big change for that is defensive tackles in the past didn't score a lot of points because that was your nose guard, your one tech, your guy that was your run block, your guy you're trying to fill the gap in running lanes. Now guys like a Cam Hayward, who in the past was considered a defensive end, because in Pittsburgh's system on paper, and if you look at their roster, he's listed as a defensive end, but since he plays inside the tackle on MLF now, he's considered a defensive tackle. He's the inside guy, not an outside guy. So for fantasy purposes, where am I going with this long-winded explanation, you might ask? For fantasy purposes, those D ends that play in 3-4s that actually can rush the passer like a Cam Hayward become very, very valuable in leagues where you have to start a defensive tackle. Because now instead of getting a nose tackle who's going to score you 50 or 60 points in an entire season, you're going to get a guy that's going to give you an advantage over your opponents if you have a guy that can get sacks from interior while they have guys that are just run stuffers in their lineup. Same thing, and we'll talk about this later in the cornerback when we talk DBs, but cornerback's a very similar thing. If you have a cornerback that plays the slot corner, he's going to get a lot more run tackles. He's going to be targeted a lot more. So he's going to be a guy that scores a lot more points than a shutdown corner on the outside who's literally not getting thrown at if he's awesome, or he's just getting a couple pass deflections, maybe a tackle a game. You want the slot corners. So that's what you want to look for when you're looking at interior defensive tackles, is you want guys that put pressure on the ball, can rush from the inside, and are not just run stuffers, are not guys that just take on double teams and let everybody else do their thing. So with that being said, I'm going to give you kind of my rundown of my rookies who I like, who I think, if you're in defensive tackle where you start D tackle leagues, some leagues also give bonuses for D tackle to end up making them worth a little more. They'll give you a little more for a solo tackle, a little more for assists, a little more for a sack, just to make that position. It's almost like a tight end premium. They're doing it to make that position worth a little bit more and try to even it out. So the guys I really like in this draft, and this is he's my number one overall as far as interior defensive lineman. And I think if you're in a league that counts linemen, he's actually going to be up in the mix with these defensive ends for me on guys I want. And that's Johnny Newton out of Illinois. Saw a ton of him right down the street, University of Illinois for me. I saw a ton of him in college. He was a guy that could have came out last year, possibly would have been fringe in the first round, beginning middle second round. He came back to school, absolutely played lights out this year for the Illini, and he is by far my number one interior lineman. Now, why is he my number one interior lineman? The guy can rush the passer from the inside. He's got a motor that never stops. He will run down plays from behind. Now, he's a little bit on the smaller side, but he's got the pass rush moves and just the ability. And again, like you said earlier, hate to compare these guys to certain players because there's really high marks to hit. But I think he could be the type of interior rusher that Aaron Donald and DeForest Buckner are. Now, he's not the size of those guys. He's never going to be the physical beast that those two guys are, because those guys were absolute animals. He's smaller than those guys, but I think his interior rush moves remind me of those two players, guys that can get off blocks, can get into the backfield from the inside. That's why I love him. If he ends up on a 3-4 team, kind of playing that defensive end, I think he could be phenomenal in that role. And then also, if he's on a 4-3 team where he's playing kind of that farther out 3 tech, 4 tech, interior lineman, I really like his ability. He's also a guy, he's got enough moves that if teams want to run twists and things like that, he can actually play outside and get outside and get around the edge. So he's my number one guy. Now, the biggest knock on him is size. Um, and that's where, people are going to get on him. He's just not a huge guy for an interior lineman. A lot of those guys you want, 300 plus pounds. He's more in that 280, 285 range. He's not super tall. Off the top of my head, I think he's about 6'2". I'd have to look that up to 100% verify that, but he's right around that range. But the interior pass rush skills and just the motor of him, he just wants it. He's a guy that is just going to keep after every play. So he's going to be those guys that get you tackles from the interior when a lot of times you don't see those interior guys getting tackles. I think he could be like a Christian Wilkinson or Tristan Wilkins from the formerly of the Dolphins, now on the Raiders.
Right.
A defensive tackle that got a lot of tackles, even though he played on the interior. I think he could be that type of player fantasy wise. And that's why for me, he's higher up there. I'm probably drafting behind all those edges if I'm playing in a league that only is D-line where you're not doing defensive tackle. But if I'm in a league with defensive tackle, he is definitely a guy I'm keeping an eye on in my drafts and figuring out where I could possibly pick him up in a later round, because he's a guy that could eventually be one of those kind of cheat code guys as a defensive tackle that could give you points when everybody else is busting out nose tackles that are scoring nothing. This guy could get you double-digit points from the interior.
So let me just say, folks, that just because, for example, you may be playing on Sleeper or another platform where it's defensive line only, and you think to yourself, well, I better get the edge rushers. Those are the sack producers. There are plenty of instances and examples of where, getting an elite defensive tackle is still beneficial for you in fantasy. Going back over, looking at Fantasy Pros's IDP scoring, starting number 1, there's number 4, DeForest Buckner, defensive tackle, Indianapolis Colts, was number 4 overall. You go to Justin Matabuki out of Baltimore, number 14 overall in fantasy points. You look at these two players, what do they have in common? The tackle numbers. We talk about the run stuffs, the tackles for a loss, the quarterback hits, like things like this. They add up. The point values for those add up also for your fantasy purposes. You go down the list, Christian Wilkins, we just talked about, Danico Autry, even Quinnen Williams. For somebody who had a down year, he was the defensive lineman 24. You look at, Aaron Donald, the defensive lineman 28, Deron Payne 29. So there are plenty of instances where you could say that getting a defensive tackle, an elite defensive tackle, one that can shed their blocks well, can get those tackles for a loss when playing against the run, or making a play against the quarterback, whether it is a sack or whether it is a tackle for a loss. Don't ignore other aspects of your fantasy league's fantasy point scoring and determining where you find value. Like heading into last season, Nate Markham and I, we were talking about how there was a correlation between using Fantasy Pros as IDP scoring between fantasy point ranking finish for the year for defensive linemen and quarterback hits. And we were finding that if you had more than 10 quarterback hits, on average, you were getting at least double-digit sacks. So you get and it kind of makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get the pressures. They're literally like hitting the quarterback, whether it's knocking them down or getting their hands on them. And more often than not, when that happens, these guys, they bring the quarterback down, So again, if you get a defensive tackle who is excelling at pressure rate, is excelling at getting to the quarterback and getting their hands on the quarterback, that's going to pay off for you fantasy-wise. So yeah, definitely, now these are I don't want to say they're rare examples, but
Well,
they don't
they're
happen
good.
often as much.
Yeah, exactly. And I like exactly what you said there. Just because they are a defensive tackle, don't just ignore them. But also, if you play in defensive tackle starting leagues, now start really looking at what guys you need to get. If you're in a startup, where do you take those guys? Because again, they're like having an elite tight end for your defense. When the top 5 guys or 6 guys outscore everyone else by a lot of points. I mean, another guy in that list, my scoring is a little bit different because it's my home league. So I just got it pulled up in front of me. But DeForest Buckner was number 6 in my league, right behind Josh Allen. So that tells you something. Number 10 was Derek Brown from Carolina, defense tackle, 1 spot ahead of Myles Garrett. So in our scoring in that league, so I mean everybody wants Myles Garrett on their team, and then you turn around and you go, oh, Derek Brown, defensive tackle. He outscored as a defense tackle more than Myles Garrett, a defensive end. That's a huge, huge advantage. Another guy out there was really nice last year was Zach Seiler for Miami. He put up some really good points. A couple of the other guys you mentioned, really good scores. I mean, you look at Quinnen Williams and Nico Autry in my league, they were sandwiched Alex Highsmith as number scored 25, 26, and 27. So they were right with that guy. I mean, Highsmith was a guy in every league I had him. I started him every week. So, starting a Danico Autry, a Quinnen Williams, those are nice spots to start those guys. So again, you don't have to completely ignore those guys. Brian Burns is another good example. So he was everybody's thinking, oh, Brian Burns, absolute stud. I got to have him in my league. Right around him in my league scoring, Aaron Donald, Harrison Phillips, and Leonard Williams and Deron Payne, all defensive tackles, all right there with Brian Burns and scoring. So don't completely ignore these guys just because they got a DT next to their name. Look how the team uses them. If they are usually those head up nose tackles are the guys you don't want. Now, sometimes they'll be all right, depending on how they're used. But yeah, what I'm talking about here, and like Jorge just said, I'm talking about like, hey, if you have starting defensive tackle, are these guys that you want to look for and maybe sneak and take a little earlier than you would in a league because of that production. But Johnny Newton, I'm taking John Newton if I only play D line. If I'm in a sleeper league and I only have D line, I'm still taking Johnny Newton. I'm taking him later than I would just because of I don't have that advantage of playing him at just defensive tackle, but he's definitely a guy I still want to see on my roster.
Nice. Who else you got for us tonight? Talk about some D tackles there,
Yeah, a
JT.
couple other guys. So Byron Murphy from Texas, he's the guy that's right up there. Everybody's been talking about. He's been phenomenal. He's a guy to me, he's right behind Johnny Newton. I think Johnny Newton's got a little bit better of a pass rush than Murphy. I think Murphy's a little bit bigger of a player. So, if, depending on where he plays, Murphy might have that. He might be able to be used a little more in different ways than Newton is. But he showed he could rush the passer from the interior at Texas. The biggest thing for him, he's got to be more consistent in finishing off tackles when he gets pressures. He was one of those guys that got a lot of pressures that didn't get necessarily turn into sacks in the college level, but he was there. He was making moves. Now, can he finish? And I think that will be huge for him in IDP if he can figure out how to get that one just a hair quicker get there. I think he could end up putting up some really nice stats. I think he's going to be an extremely high draft pick in this draft. I think I'd be really shocked if him and Newton fall outside the top 20. I think they're both definitely first rounders. They could slip into the 20s, but I think both those guys could end up going top 20.
No, I like what you were talking about Byron Murphy, and you hit the nail on the head. Elite win rate for a defensive interior lineman, but the sack production there, right? So again, it's more so, and correct me if I'm wrong here, we're talking about athletic profiles and ability to finish. That's the athletic profile is what bumps them up in value, but the lack of ability to finish may cause him to fall a little bit in terms of fantasy stock.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you 100% on that. The athletic profiles there. Can he be the finisher? Is he Chop Robinson
Right.
as an interior lineman? He's got the skills. He's got the ability. Can he be the guy that finishes off plays? And the same thing with Chop.
Nice.
Next guy on the list for me, Leonard Taylor III from Miami. Now, he's going to be an interesting one. He's a toss up for me. He could move. He's probably stuck in that third spot for me, but he definitely could move down depending on his landing spot for the NFL draft. And here's why for me. He's a guy that definitely could play a defensive end, that 4 tech in a 3-4 defense. But if he gets on a 4-3 team and they decide, because he's a big guy, if they decide he's more of a nose tackle, which I think I could see teams going, they like him as a nose, really taking on double teams, filling up the middle, and kind of trying to free off his ends and linebackers. Now, while that's super important in real life NFL football, that kills you in IDP fantasy because he is not going to get tackles. He's not going to get pressures because he's the guy taking on all the blocks. So to me, depending on where he ends up, if he ends up in a 3-4 and somebody makes him the nose tackle, that hurts his value for me. If he ends up in a 3-4 and now he's playing basically a defensive end, I like that a lot more because now you know, hey, he's out in space. He's not going to be taking on double teams all the time. That's where I like him more production wise, but he's a guy I want to keep an eye on because he's very team dependent for me. Depending on how the defense, whoever he goes to, how they want to use him makes a difference on whether I think he's going to be a valuable IDP asset or not.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And so, when going down the list of, the players who are some of the top rated interior defenders, you like what you see. Again, going back here to what you were talking about with Leonard Taylor III out of Miami, the pressure win rate is there. Like his ability to shed blocks, his ability to get past the offensive lineman is great. It's again, I may sound like a broken record here. It's the ability to finish here, but his win rate is very elite. So again, I like this. I like this pick here.
Thank you. We're gonna say that about a lot of guys. So I don't feel like you're repeating yourself too much, even though you are repeating yourself. It is key. It is key. The win rate and finishing is going to make a difference for a lot of these guys. The next guy for me on the list I've got right now is number 4. He's so far is the big winner of the combine and pro day, and that is Braden Fisk from Florida State. He was a guy that people liked. They just weren't 100% sure about him. And then he came in and blew people away at the combine. He was way more athletic than people, I think, thought he would be. And I think whenever people like your tape, they want to see that the athleticism matches it. Then when they saw him at the combine, they're like, okay, he is as athletic as we really need him to be. It wasn't just a production thing. We'll say this a lot, but the interior guys that just play with a motor, it's a big difference because a lot of those guys are big. They're big and they get tired. Yeah. They get big and they get tired and they take plays off. And so that hurts fantasy production. When you're taking plays off, you're like, I'm out of this one. They're running to the outside. I'm just going to stay back here and stand here, wait for the next play, get my energy back, and run again. Fisk, he's not one of those guys. He's like a Johnny Newton. They're going to chase every play down. If you run the sideline away from him on a sweep pass, he's going to be busting his ass to get over that sweep pass and look to take away the cutback. So that's what you want out of these interior defensive line. You want guys that are moving, can help you make tackles. He's 6'4", 292. He did 26 reps at 225, which is very solid, was right near the top. His 4.78 40, I think, was very impressive. Getting under 4.8 as a almost 300-pound lineman is just phenomenal. 1.68 10-yard split means he gets off the ball quick and moves. Not only that, 33.5-inch vertical jump and a 9.9 broad jump. I mean, those are really good numbers. And then his pro day and everything else, he showed really good footwork and quickness, picking up his feet, getting around over barriers when they're having him run agility drills, running around the circle pickup. He's got nice bend for that interior guy. So I think he's big enough to play the inside. And again, I would say this a lot. Those guys end up being 3-4 defensive ends. I love to take those guys. Those are my favorite interior linemen to take. But he's another guy I think can play that 4 tech and a 4-3. And if you get that outside guy real wide on him, where he's playing a 7 tech coming from way outside. He has the ability to take a guy one-on-one, a guard one-on-one, and beat that guard and get that pressure. And again, if a guy's bringing pressure from the outside and has to step up in the pocket, he has enough power to push that guard back into the QB who's stepping up in the pocket and get a sack that way. So Fizz is a guy it's really jumped on my list. I think he's probably an early to mid second round pick now in the NFL draft, but I just really like what I saw at him. He seems everything that looks, you look at him, he looks like a productive IDP player.
Yeah, I 100% agree. You go back to 2022, you look at the snaps, location snaps by alignment, B gap 301, but outside tackle 213 snaps. You go back to 2023, played primarily in the B gap, but you look at the production. First of all, we go back to the win rate, right? His ability to shed blocks, right? But here we have an instance where we've seen that match production. You look at 2022. When he was splitting time between playing B gap and playing outside tackle, 8 sacks, 5 quarterback hits, ding, 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 fantasy points. You like that. You go to 2023, 6 sacks, 3 quarterback hits, ding, 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 fantasy points. We love that. So whether he can be lined up on the outside or he can come inside, that works out beautifully for IDP purposes. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of this guy.
Yeah, I love what he can bring. I definitely love what he can bring.
All right, we got time for one more player.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a guy who's he's on the edge right now here for this. So a guy that I really like is Darius Robinson. So Darius Robinson is a guy that played on the interior of Missouri originally, bumped to the outside, played DN this year, and really was productive. A guy that's got really nice size. He can play that. I think, and I've said this. I feel like I'm you on the repeat. 3-4 technique. If he ends up playing that outside, D end at 3-4 in the 3-4, I think he's made for that. He's 6'4, 290, 295, really strong, can rush the passer, really improved his pass rush this year at Missouri. Right now he's listed as a D end. If you look at all the lists, everything like that. So I love him as a D end. He's a guy that, he was awesome at the Senior Bowl. Absolutely showed out at the Senior Bowl this year. I think he could maybe sneak into the end of the first round or into beginning of the second round in the NFL draft. DN, I really like him. He's just outside of my top 5 as a DN, but if he gets that D tackle eligibility in my fantasy league, he jumps up my board. If he ends up being able to be a D tackle, he's right up there with Murphy and Johnny Newton for me, because the guy can bring the pass. He's huge. He's got power, can bring the rush. And again, if he's played outside and inside, I love that versatility out of him. And I think if he gets listed again, I still like him in DN. So I'm not giving up on him if he's DN, but D tackle, he moves up my list if he gets that kind of eligibility in IDP leagues.
Awesome. Love it. Okay, folks. Well, that's going to round out our show today, talking about IDP rookie prospects, specifically defensive linemen. JT, let everybody know where they can find your rookie rankings.
Yeah, you can find me on the extra Twitter at JT Orange. Hit me up on there and talk about anything, everything, IDP, and everything in between. You can find my rookie rankings on DLF and my top 150. I have my top 20 rookie rankings right now. Also, my top 150 overall rankings are over there on DLF currently.
And you can find my dynasty rankings, which will be updated by the end of the week, I promise. Ready for your viewing pleasure on Saturday morning over at fantasyandframes.com. JT, you got an article coming out pretty soon talking about one of our favorite dynasty targets at the linebacker position. Who? You'll have to go to fantasyandframes.com to check out.
Yeah, I got to check it out. I've been talking about him on a few shows. I can't help myself. I've been people keep asking me about my my linebacker buys in IDP, and he's on there. So yeah, definitely gonna have to check out that article on why I love him and who it actually is.
Love it. And don't forget, folks, wherever you're watching, whether it's on X, please head over to Fantasy and Frames. Give us a follow. If you're over on YouTube, subscribe, hit the notification bell. We really appreciate it. We're on TikTok. We're putting out tons of TikToks, tons of YouTube shorts, covering everything from offense to defense. So we really have you covered here. And so Yeah, that's JT. Any plans for the weekend? Anything fun coming up?
Oh
Before we
man,
leave?
I that NCAA basketball March Madness baby. I got Illinois. Like I said, I live right here. Illinois plays tomorrow night, and right before them, San Diego State went there as well. Rematch national championship game, UConn, San Diego State. I went to the game last year as a San Diego State fan. I also went with my sister and brother-in-law who went to Florida Atlantic. My brother-in-law played basketball there, so we went to the Final Four together because I'm like, when are we ever going to see Florida Atlantic and San Diego State ever make the Final Four ever again? Maybe
Right.
never. So we went, and it was awesome. San Diego State won on a last second shot. Felt good for me, felt bad for my sister and brother-in-law, but we got a rematch of the national championship game, San Diego State UConn. And I'm really hoping San Diego State figure out a way to keep it closer this time as they got blown out in the national championship game last year. It's going to be tough as UConn looks really good. But I'm hoping that game, and then I'm really excited for Illinois, one of the best teams they've had in over almost 2 decades. Just a really exciting team taking on Iowa State tomorrow. So this whole weekend, I've got basketball on the mind. I will still be checking trades, doing stuff on fantasy online as far as football is concerned, but I'm going to be watching a lot of NCAA basketball action this weekend.
I think you're actually like at the, if not the top or very top of the Fantasy and Frames March Madness bracket. So not
Hope
surprised
so.
there
My
whatsoever.
son, I was laughing. My son filled out a bracket this year, 10 years old. Very first bracket he's ever filled out. Currently leading my friend Toast, leading his bracket. So he's in first place right now as we're entering the Sweet 16. So pretty fired up for him, hoping that he moves on and does well as he's pretty pumped for the first time being in it. I think now he's going to be hooked. If he ends up winning, he's going to be hooked and have to fill out a bracket all the time.
Oh, and the trash talking will never stop there.
It will never stop. He knows how to trash talk. When he beats me, I will never hear the end of how he had a better bracket than mine.
That's hilarious. All right, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. Next week, we'll be talking about IDP rookie prospects at the linebacker position. So stay tuned. And for those who are just catching the end of this, go head over to YouTube, check it out, this episode, or wait till tomorrow morning where we have this released in podcast form. So for Justin Taylor, aka JT, I am Jorge Edwards. We will see y'all next week.